When you picture New Zealand, you probably think of these incredible, sweeping landscapes, right? A peaceful, almost perfect country that always seems to be at the top of every best places to live list. But what if I told you there's another story unfolding? A story where, underneath that postcard perfect image, the country is grappling with its own people, leaving in absolutely record numbers. Let's get into it. This quote, wow, it just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? This is the voice of a generation that's facing a really tough choice. I mean, you can't exactly deposit a beautiful mountain view into your bank account. It perfectly captures this tension between the dream of New Zealand and the day-to-day struggle just to make ends meet. So that's what we're going to start with. Let's try to bridge that gap between the image of New Zealand that we all have in our heads and the cold, hard economic facts on the ground that are pushing people to leave. Let's start with a number, 73,900. Just let that sink in. That's the record number of New Zealand citizens who packed up everything and left in the year to August 2025 alone. I mean, this isn't a small trickle we're talking about. It's a flood, and it tells you that something really big is going on. And you have to remember, behind that huge number are thousands of personal stories. Take someone like Hayden Fisher. When he was in Wellington, he was literally putting his groceries on Afterpay just to get through the week. A year later, after moving to Sydney, he's finally on a path to actually being financially stable. His story just shows that for so many people, this isn't about giving up on their country. It's about pure financial survival. So how does this all add up to a huge national trend? Let's dig into the hard data behind what people are calling the Great Kiwi Exodus to really understand how massive this moment is for New Zealand. Okay, so this chart really puts things in perspective. The net loss of citizens in 2025 has now officially blown past the old record, which was set right after the global financial crisis. And that is a huge deal. It means what's happening right now is a bigger demographic shock than what happened during one of the worst economic crises in modern history. So where's everybody going? Well, this chart makes it pretty darn clear. Kiwis have always done their OE, their overseas experience. But this isn't some random scattering across the globe. A whopping 58% are making one very specific trip, right across the Tasman Sea to Australia. It is by far the #1 destination. And that, of course, brings us to our next question. Why Australia? Well, the answer, for the most part, is pretty simple and pretty powerful. People are following the money. So let's look at the economic gap that's pulling so many people across the ditch. This slide basically says it all. I mean, just look at the difference in GDP per capita. That's a key way to measure a country's wealth. Australia's is over $64,000, while New Zealand is sitting at just $48,000. That's not a little gap, that's a chasm. And it translates directly into higher wages, more job opportunities, and just a more affordable life. And again, let's put a human face on these big numbers. Genevieve Fulton, who's only 22, saw her hourly wage more than double the second she moved to Melbourne. And for her, it wasn't just about having extra cash, it was about buying her time back. She could work fewer hours in a hospo job and actually work on her real career in illustration. Her words, calling Wellington hollow, that's such a powerful way to describe the effect of this brain drain. Okay, so following the money explains why people are pulled to Australia. But what about the things pushing them out of New Zealand in the first place? Now we're going to peel back the layers and look at the deeper systemic problems, the cracks in the foundation that have been growing for a long, long time. And the first and maybe the biggest crack in that foundation is something that affects just about everyone: housing. That classic Kiwi dream of owning your own home, for a whole generation, it's become a complete fantasy. I want you to try and wrap your head around this number, 256%. That is how much house prices in New Zealand shot up between 2000 and 2021. And that's after you adjust for inflation. This wasn't just steady growth. It was an absolute explosion that basically blew the dream of homeownership to bits for so many people. And here's what that explosion looks like in real life. The house price to income ratio is now over 11-1. Think about what that means. The average house costs more than 11 times the average yearly salary. How is anyone, especially a young person or young family, supposed to save up a deposit in an environment like that? So, if you can't buy, you're forced to rent. But guess what? There's no relief there either. Almost half of all renters in New Zealand, 46%, are spending more than 30% of their income just on rent. That's the international benchmark for being under severe housing stress. It leaves you with barely anything left for savings or food or, having a life.
To really get how things got so tough, we actually have to go back in time a bit. Back in the 1980s, New Zealand went through this radical economic shakeup called Roger-momics. The idea was to create a more competitive, free market economy by basically tearing down a lot of the old welfare state. It was like economic shock therapy for the whole country.
And this timeline here shows the long-term consequences of those decisions. Yeah, the reforms opened up the economy, but they also crushed collective bargaining power for workers, led to huge cuts in public spending, and kind of hollowed out the country's industries. And all of that set the stage for decades of wages not really going up and inequality getting worse. And that legacy of underinvestment, well, today, it's literally visible everywhere you look. You've got a transport system with $1.5 billion hole in its budget. You've got water pipes bursting. You have a healthcare system with nearly 500,000 people waiting for surgery. And you have 1 in 5 schools that are basically unfit to be used. These aren't just minor annoyances. They're daily signs that the country's very foundation is crumbling. So, what does all this mean for the future of New Zealand? In this last section, let's look at the real consequences of this exodus and how the country's political leaders are even responding to it. You see, this isn't just about losing people. It's about who is being lost. What New Zealand is going through is a classic brain drain. It's basically exporting its most critical, highly trained workers for free. Over 30% of all doctors trained in New Zealand are now working overseas. And in 2024 alone, a record 800 teachers moved to Australia, pulled by much higher salaries. So how are the politicians reacting? Well, as you'd probably expect, the response is pretty divided. The current government tends to see this as just part of a cycle, They think people will come back when the economy improves. The opposition Labour Party frames it as a failure by the government to provide opportunities. And the Green Party calls it what it is for a lot of people, a tragedy, a sign that people have simply lost hope in their own country's future. Which really brings us right back to where we started. For decades, New Zealand was sold to the world and to its own people as this kind of paradise, a fair, balanced society. But today, it's a nation that's really struggling with the fact that a whole generation feels completely and totally priced out of its own future. And that leaves us with this final, really important question. This isn't just about economics or migration stats. This is about a nation's identity, its promise to its own citizens. What happens when paradise becomes so expensive that the only way to find a better life is to leave it behind?